and this was then former Vice President Biden before all that happened in 2020. Very important here. He did not caution against violence. Play cut 11.
Well, in addressing the unrest, former Vice President Joe Biden initially did not caution against violence, but challenged white people to understand the everyday injustices black people suffer.
That is just one example of hundreds we could play. Ben, what happened next then? Remind the audience of the material increase in crime, in just arson, anarchy in the streets. This was unfortunately one of the deadlier, more crime-ridden summers since the 1990s because of the misrepresentation of this incident. Ben.
So in order to truly understand what happened, you have to understand that the American crime rate had dropped steadily between 1994, which is when the crime bill was signed, the much maligned crime bill, and between 2013. The crime rate in virtually all of America's major cities went down. Then 2014, you get what's called the Ferguson effect, a term coined by Heather McDonald, which suggested that after the Michael Brown case, which again was a completely false case, the idea that Michael Brown was murdered by a white police officer, you saw a move toward depolicing in cities where cops said, I'm not going to go into a dangerous situation in which I have to face down somebody of a different race because I might end up on tape. And if I do my job, I'm spending the rest of my life in prison. And so that led to an increase of literally hundreds of murders over the course of the next few years. Then the crime rate seemed to even out over the course of the first Trump administration in many of these areas, sort of leveled out. And then in 2020, it absolutely skyrocketed because all over the country, there were city councils that were withdrawing funding. Police officers understood. They knew the math. Police officers are human beings, as it turns out, and they know the math. If you go out and you do your job, and if you have to shoot a person who is not your race, if you're a white cop and you shoot a black person, and it turns out that it's under any disputed circumstances, or even in many cases in undisputed circumstances, you will become a target of such ire that you may find yourself in the dock. You're just not going to do it. If there's a situation where bad things could happen to you, or you could just sit in your cop car. You're going to sit in your cop car and not do it. And so what you see is a depolicing movement that comes not just from the top, but also from the bottom. And the spike in the crime rate in America's major cities was extraordinary in 2021. You saw hundreds of additional murders in America's major cities, by the way, disproportionately of black young people, because it turns out that in order to actually crack down on the kinds of crime that are most likely to cause murder in the United States, namely crime that happens in America's major cities and very often includes gangs, you need cops on the streets doing their jobs. When you remove cops from the streets, and when you tell cops that if they do their jobs, they might end up in the dock, you're going to get a massive increase in the crime rate. That's precisely what you saw over subsequent years. And that doesn't even include things like Chaz Chop in Seattle, where an entire city of Seattle was basically taken over by Antifa rioters, or the takeover of Portland completely by Antifa and the wrecking of a great American city, the destruction of San Francisco. All of these things happened on the back of the BLM moment, when it turns out that the police became writ large the great villains in the American national story. And it turns out that without the cops, things get real bad real fast.